is August 6th, 1945. The hour was early, the morning still, warm and beautiful. Shimmering leaves, reflecting sunlight from a cloudless sky, made a pleasant contrast with shadows in my garden as I gazed absently through wide-flung doors opening to the south. Clad in drawers and undershirt, I was sprawled on the living room floor, exhausted because I had just spent a sleepless night on duty as an air warden in my hospital. Suddenly, a strong flash of light startled me, and then another. So well does one recall little things that I remember vividly how a stone lantern in the garden became brilliantly lit, and I debated whether this light was caused by a magnesium flare or sparks from a passing trolley. Garden shadows disappeared. The view where a moment before all had been so bright and sunny was now dark and hazy. Through swirling dust, I could barely discern a wooden column that had supported one corner of my house. It was leaning crazily and the roof sagged dangerously. Moving instinctively, I tried to escape, but rubble and fallen timbers barred the way. By picking my way cautiously, I managed to reach the roca and stepped down into my garden. A profound weakness overcame me, so I stopped to regain my strength. To my surprise, I discovered that I was completely naked. How odd. Where were my drawers and undershirt? What had happened? All over the right side of my body I was cut and bleeding. A large splinter was protruding from a mangled wound in my thigh, and something warm trickled into my mouth. My cheek was torn, I discovered as I felt it gingerly, with the lower lip laid wide open. Embedded in my neck was a sizable fragment of glass, which I matter-of-factly dislodged, and with the detachment of one stunned and shocked, I studied it and my blood-stained hand. Where was my wife? Suddenly thoroughly alarmed, I began to yell for her. "Yaiko-san! Yaiko-san! Where are you?" Blood began to spurt. Had my carotid artery been cut? Would I bleed to death? Frightened and irrational, I called out again, "It's a 500-ton bomb! Yaiko-san, where are you? A 500-ton bomb has fallen!" Yaiko-san, pale and frightened, her clothes torn and blood-stained, emerged from the ruins of our house holding her elbow. Seeing her, I was reassured. My own panic assuaged, I tried to reassure her. "We'll be all right," I exclaimed. "Only let's get out of here as fast as we can." She nodded, and I motioned for her to follow me. The shortest path to the street lay through the house next door, so through the house we went, running, stumbling, falling, and then running again, until in headlong flight we tripped over something and fell sprawling into the street. Getting to my feet, I discovered that I had tripped over a man's head. "Excuse me? Excuse me, please," I cried hysterically. There was no answer. The man was dead. The head had belonged to a young officer whose body was crushed beneath a massive gate. We stood in the street, uncertain and afraid, until a house across from us began to sway and then with a rending motion fell almost at our feet. Our own house began to sway, and in a minute it, too, collapsed in a cloud of dust. Other buildings caved in or toppled. Fires sprang up and whipped by a vicious wind began to spread. It finally dawned on us that we could not stay there in the street, so we turned our steps towards the hospital. Our home was gone. We were wounded and needed treatment, and after all, it was my duty to be with my staff. This latter was an irrational thought. What good could I be to anyone, hurt as I was? We started out, but after 20 or 30 steps, I had to stop. My breath became short, my heart pounded, and my legs gave way under me. An overpowering thirst seized me, and I begged Yaiko-san to find me some water. But there was no water to be found. After a little my strength somewhat returned, and we were able to go on. I was still naked, and although I did not feel the least bit of shame, I was disturbed to realize that modesty had deserted me. On rounding a corner, we came upon a soldier standing idly in the street. He had a towel draped across his shoulder, and I asked if he would give it to me to cover my nakedness. The soldier surrendered the towel quite willingly, but said not a word. A little later I lost the towel, and Yaiko-san took off her apron and tied it around my loins. Our progress towards the hospital was interminably slow, until finally my legs, stiff from drying blood, refused to carry me farther. The strength, even the will, to go on deserted me, so I told my wife, who was almost as badly hurt as I, to go on alone. This she objected to, but there was no choice. She had to go ahead and try to find someone to come back for me. Yeko-san looked into my face for a moment, and then, without saying a word, turned away and began running towards the hospital. Once she looked back and waved, and in a moment she was swallowed up in the gloom. It was quite dark now, and with my wife gone, a feeling of dreadful loneliness overcame me. I must have gone out of my head lying there in the road, because the next thing I recall was discovering that the clot on my thigh had been dislodged and blood was again spurting from the wound. I pressed my hand to the bleeding area, and after a while the bleeding stopped and I felt better. Could I go on? I tried. It was all a nightmare. My wounds, the darkness, the road ahead. My movements were ever so slow, only my mind was running at top speed. In time, I came to an open space where the houses had been removed to make a fire lane. Through the dim light, I could make out ahead of me the hazy outlines of the Communications Bureau's big concrete building, and beyond it, the hospital. My spirits rose because I knew that now someone would find me, and if I should die, at least my body would be found. I paused to rest. Gradually, things around me came into focus. There were the shadowy forms of people, some of whom looked like walking ghosts. Others moved as though in pain, like scarecrows, their arms held out from their bodies with forearms and hands dangling. These people puzzled me until I suddenly realized that they had been burned and were holding their arms out to prevent the painful friction of raw surfaces rubbing together. A naked woman carrying a naked baby came into view. I averted my gaze. Perhaps they had been in the bath. But then I saw a naked man, and it occurred to me that, like myself, some strange thing had deprived them of their clothes. An old woman lay near me with an expression of suffering on her face. But she made no sound. Indeed, one thing was common to everyone I saw: complete silence. All who could were moving in the direction of the hospital. I joined in the dismal parade when my strength was somewhat recovered, and at last reached the gates of the Communications Bureau. Familiar surroundings, familiar faces. There was Mr. Iguchi and Mr. Yoshihiro and my old friend, Mr. Serra, the head of the business office. They hastened to give me a hand, their expressions of pleasure changing to alarm when they saw that I was hurt. I was too happy to see them to share their concern. No time was lost over greetings. They eased me onto a stretcher and carried me into the communications building, ignoring my protests that I could walk. Later, I learned that the hospital was so overrun that the Communications Bureau had to be used as an emergency hospital. The rooms and corridors were crowded with people, many of whom I recognized as neighbors. To me, it seemed that the whole community was there. My friends passed me through an open window into a janitor's room recently converted to an emergency first aid station. The room was a shambles. Fallen plaster, broken furniture, and debris littered the floor. The walls were cracked, and a heavy steel window casement was twisted and almost wrenched from its seating. What a place to dress the wounds of the injured. To my great surprise, who should appear but my private nurse, Miss Kato, and Mr. Mizuguchi, and old Mrs. Seiki. Miss Kato set about examining my wounds without speaking a word. No one spoke. I asked for a shirt and pajamas. They got them for me, but still no one spoke. Why was everyone so quiet? Miss Kato finished the examination, and in a moment it felt as if my chest was on fire. She had begun to paint my wounds with iodine, and no amount of entreaty would make her stop. With no alternative but to endure the iodine, I tried to divert myself by looking out the window. The hospital lay directly opposite, with part of the roof and the third-floor sunroom in plain view, and as I looked up, I witnessed a sight which made me forget my smarting wounds. Smoke was pouring out of the sunroom windows. The hospital was afire. "Fire!" I shouted. "Fire! Fire! The hospital is on fire!" My friends looked up. It was true. The hospital was on fire. The alarm was given, and from all sides people took up the cry. The high-pitched voice of Mr. Serra, the business officer, rose above the others, and it seemed as if his was the first voice I had heard that day. The uncanny stillness was broken. Our little world was now in pandemonium. I remember that Dr. Sasada, chief of the pediatric service, came in and tried to reassure me, but I could scarcely hear him above the din. I heard Dr. Hinoi's voice and then Dr. Koyama's. Both were shouting orders to evacuate the hospital, and with such vigor that it sounded as though the sheer strength of their voices could hasten those who were slow to obey. The sky became bright as flames from the hospital mounted. Soon the bureau was threatened, and Mr. Serra gave the order to evacuate. My stretcher was moved into a rear garden and placed beneath an old cherry tree. Other patients limped into the garden or were carried until soon the entire area became so crowded that only the very ill had room to lie down. No one talked, and the ominous silence was relieved only by a subdued rustle among so many people, restless, in pain, anxious, and afraid, waiting for something else to happen. The sky filled with black smoke and glowing sparks. Flames rose and the heat set currents of air in motion. Updrafts became so violent that sheets of zinc roofing were hurled aloft and released, humming and twirling in erratic flight. Pieces of flaming wood soared and fell like fiery swallows. While I was trying to beat out the flames, a hot ember seared my ankle. It was all I could do to keep from being burned alive. The bureau started to burn, and window after window became a square of flame until the whole structure was converted into a crackling, hissing inferno. Scorching winds howled around us, whipping dust and ashes into our eyes and up our noses. Our mouths became dry, our throats raw and sore from the biting smoke pulled into our lungs. Coughing was uncontrollable. We would have moved back, but a group of wooden barracks behind us caught fire and began to burn like tinder. The heat finally became too intense to endure, and we were left no choice but to abandon the garden. Those who could fled, those who could not perished. Had it not been for my devoted friends, I would have died, but again, they came to the rescue and carried my stretcher to the main gate on the other side of the bureau. Here, a small group of people were already clustered, and here I found my wife. Dr. Sasada and Miss Kato joined us. Fires sprang up on every side as violent winds fanned flames from one building to another. Soon, we were surrounded. The ground we held in front of the communications bureau became an oasis in a desert of fire. As the flames came closer, the heat became more intense, and if someone in our group had not had the presence of mind to drench us with water too from a fire hose, I doubt if anyone could have survived. Hot as it was, I began to shiver. The drenching was too much. My heart pounded. Things began to whirl until all before me blurred. Kurushi, I murmured weakly. I am done. The sound of voices reached my ears as though from a great distance, and finally became louder as if close at hand. I opened my eyes. Dr. Sasada was feeling my pulse. What had happened? Miss Kato gave me an injection. My strength gradually returned. I must have fainted. Huge raindrops began to fall. Some thought a thunderstorm was beginning and would extinguish the fires, but these drops were capricious. A few fell, and then a few more, and that was all the rain we saw. The first floor of the bureau was now ablaze, and flames were spreading rapidly towards our little oasis by the gate. Right then, I could hardly understand the situation, much less do anything about it. An iron window frame, loosened by fire, crashed to the ground behind us. A ball of fire whizzed by me, setting my clothes ablaze. They drenched me with water again. From then on, I am confused as to what happened. I do remember Dr. Hinoi because of the pain I felt when he jerked me to my feet. I remember being moved, or rather dragged, and my whole spirit rebelling against the torment I was made to endure. My next memory is of an open area. The fires must have receded. I was alive. My friends had somehow managed to rescue me again. A head popped out of an air raid dugout, and I heard the unmistakable voice of old Mrs. Seiki. "Cheer up, doctor. Everything will be all right. The north side is burnt out. We have nothing further to fear from the fire." I might have been her son. the way the old lady calmed and reassured me. And indeed, she was right. The entire northern side of the city was completely burned. The sky was still dark, but whether it was evening or midday, I could not tell. It might even have been the next day. Time had no meaning. What I had experienced might have been crowded into a moment or been endured through the monotony of eternity. Smoke was still rising from the second floor of the hospital, but the fire had stopped. There was nothing left to burn, I thought. But later, I learned that the first floor of the hospital had escaped destruction largely through the courageous efforts of Dr. Koyama and Dr. Hinoi. The streets were deserted except for the dead. Some looked as if they had been frozen by death while in the full action of flight. Others lay sprawled as though some giant had flung them to their death from a great height. Hiroshima was no longer a city, but a burnt-over prairie. To the east and to the west, everything was flattened. The distant mountains seemed nearer than I could ever remember. The hills of Ushita and the woods of Nagitsu loomed out of the haze and smoke like the nose and eyes on a face. How small Hiroshima was with its houses gone. The wind changed, and the sky again darkened with smoke. Suddenly I heard someone shout, "Planes! Enemy planes!" Could that be possible after what had already happened? What was there left to bomb? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a familiar name. A nurse calling Dr. Katsube. "It is Dr. Katsube. It's him!" shouted old Mrs. Seiki, a happy ring to her voice. "Dr. Katsube has come!" It was Dr. Katsube, our head surgeon, but he seemed completely unaware of us as he hurried past, making a straight line for the hospital. Enemy planes were forgotten. So great was our happiness that Dr. Katsube had been spared to return to us. Before I could protest, my friends were carrying me into the hospital. The distance was only 100 meters, but it was enough to cause my heart to pound and make me sick and faint. I recall the hard table and the pain when my face and lip were sutured, but I have no recollection of the 40 or more other wounds Dr. Katsube closed before night. They removed me to an adjoining room, and I remember feeling relaxed and sleepy. The sun had gone down, leaving a dark red sky. The red flames of the burning city had scorched the heavens. I gazed at the sky until sleep overtook me. August 7th, 1945. I must have slept soundly, because when I opened my eyes, a piercing hot sun was shining in on me. There were no shutters or curtains to lessen the glare, and for that matter, no windows. The groans of patients assaulted my ears. Everything was in a turmoil. Instruments, window frames, and debris littered the floor. The walls and ceilings were scarred and picked as though someone had sprinkled sesame seeds over their surfaces. Most of the marks had been made by slivers of flying glass, but the larger scars had been caused by hurtling instruments and pieces of window casements. Near a window, an instrument cabinet was overturned. The headpiece had been knocked off the ear, nose, and throat examining chair, and a broken sun lamp was overturned across the seat. I saw nothing that was not broken or in disorder. Dr. Sasada, who had looked after me yesterday, lay on my left. I had thought he escaped injury, but now I could see that he was badly burned. His arms and hands were bandaged, and his childish face so obscured by swelling that I would not have recognized him had it not been for his voice. My wife lay to my right. Her face was covered with a white ointment, giving her a ghostly appearance. Her right arm was in a sling. Miss Cato, only slightly wounded, was between me and my wife. She had nursed all of us throughout the night. My wife, seeing that I was awake, turned and said, "Last night you seemed to be suffering." "Yes," said Miss Cato, chiming in. "I don't know how many times I examined your breathing." I recognized Dr. Fuji's wife sitting motionless on a bench near the wall. Her face bore an expression of anguish and despair. Turning to Miss Cato, I asked what the matter was, and she replied, "Mrs. Fuji was not hurt very much, but her baby was. It died during the night." "Where is Dr. Fuji?" I inquired. "Their older daughter is lost," she answered. "He's been out all night looking for her and hasn't returned." Dr. Koyama came in to inquire how we were. The sight of him, with his head bandaged and an arm in a sling, brought tears to my eyes. He had worked all night and was even now thinking of others before himself. Dr. Katsubi, our surgeon, and Miss Takao, a surgical nurse, were with Dr. Koyama, who was now deputy director. They all looked tired and haggard, and their white clothes were dirty and blood-stained. I learned that Mr. Iguchi, our driver, had contrived to rig up an emergency operating light from a car battery and headlight with which they had managed to operate until the light went out just before day. Dr. Koyama, observing my concern, remarked, "Doctor, everything is all right." Dr. Katsubi looked me over and after feeling my pulse said, "You received many wounds, but they all missed vital spots." He then described them and told me how they had been treated. I was surprised to learn that my shoulder had been severely cut, but relieved at his optimism for my recovery. "How many patients are in the hospital?" I asked Dr. Koyama. "About 150, he replied. "Quite a few have died, but there are still so many that there is no place to put one's foot down. They are packed in everywhere, even the toilets." Nodding, Dr. Katsube added, "There are about a half dozen beneath the stairway and about 50 in the front garden of the hospital." They discussed methods for restoring order, at least to the extent of making the corridors passable. In the space of one night, patients had become packed, like the rice in sushi, into every nook and cranny of the hospital. The majority were badly burned, a few severely injured. All were critically ill. Many had been near the heart of the city and in their efforts to flee managed to get only as far as the communications hospital before their strength failed. Others, from nearer by, came deliberately to seek treatment, or because this building, standing alone where all else was destroyed, represented shelter and a place of refuge. They came as an avalanche and overran the hospital. There was no friend or relative to minister to their needs, no one to prepare their food. Everything was in disorder, and to make matters worse was the vomiting and diarrhea. Patients who could not walk urinated and defecated where they lay. Those who could walk would feel their way to the exits and relieve themselves there. Persons entering or leaving the hospital could not avoid stepping in the filth, so closely was it spread. The front entrance became covered with feces overnight, and nothing could be done for there were no bedpans and, even if there had been, no one to carry them to the patients. Disposing of the dead was a minor problem, but to clean the rooms and corridors of urine, feces, and vomitus was impossible. The people who were burned suffered most because as their skin peeled away, glistening raw wounds were exposed to the heat and filth. This was the environment patients had to live in. It made one's hair stand on end, but there was no way to help the situation. This was the pattern conversation took as I lay there and listened. It was inconceivable. "When can I get up?" I asked Dr. Katsubi. "Perhaps I can do something to help." "Not until your sutures are out," he answered, "and that won't be for at least a week." With that to think about, they left me. I was not left long with my thoughts. One after another, the staff came in to express their concern over my injuries and to wish me a speedy recovery. Some of my visitors embarrassed me, for they appeared to be as badly injured as myself. Had it been possible, I would have concealed my whereabouts. Dr. Nishimura, president of the Okayama Medical Association, came all the way from my native city, 90 miles away, to see me. He had been crew captain of the boat team when we were classmates in medical school. As soon as he saw me, tears welled up in his eyes. He looked at me a moment and then exclaimed, "I say, old fellow, you are alive. What a pleasant surprise. How are you getting along?" Without waiting for an answer, he continued, "Last night, we heard that Hiroshima had been attacked by a new weapon. The damage was slight, they told us, but in order to see for myself and to lend a hand if extra physicians were needed, I secured a truck and came on down. What a frightful mess greeted us when we arrived. Are you sure you are all right?" And again, without stopping for me to reply, he went on to tell about the heartbreaking things he witnessed from the truck as he entered the city. These were the first details any of us had heard, so we listened intently. While he talked, All I could think of was the fear and uncertainty that must be preying on my old mother who lived in the country near Okayama. When he had finished, I asked Dr. Nishimura if he would get word to my mother, and also to a sister who lived in Okayama, that Yaeko-san and I were safe. He assured me that he would, and before leaving he also promised to organize a team of doctors and nurses to come down and help as soon as he could get them together. Dr. Tabuchi, an old friend from Ushita, came in. His face and hands had been burned, though not badly, and after an exchange of greetings, I asked if he knew what had happened. "I was in the backyard pruning some trees when it exploded," he answered. "The first thing I knew, there was a blinding white flash of light, and a wave of intense heat struck my cheek. This was odd, I thought, when in the next instant there was a tremendous blast. The force of it knocked me clean over," he continued, "but fortunately it didn't hurt me, and my wife wasn't hurt either. But you should have seen our house. It didn't topple over, it just inclined. I have never seen such a mess. Inside and out, everything was simply ruined. Even so, we are happy to be alive, and what's more, Ryoji, our son, survived. I didn't tell you that he had gone into the city on business that morning. About midnight, after we had given up all hope that he could possibly survive in the dreadful fire that followed the blast, he came home. Listen," he continued, "why don't you come on home with me? My house is certainly nothing to look at now, but it is better than here." It was impossible for me to accept his kind offer, and I tried to decline in a way that would not hurt his feelings. "Dr. Tabuchi," I replied, "we are all grateful for your kind offer, but Dr. Katsube has just warned me that I must lie perfectly still until my wounds are healed." Dr. Tabuchi accepted my explanation with some reluctance, and after a pause, he made ready to go. "Don't go," I said. "Please tell us more of what occurred yesterday." "It was a horrible sight," said Dr. Tabuchi. "Hundreds of injured people who were trying to escape to the hills past our house. The sight of them was almost unbearable. Their faces and hands were burnt and swollen, and great sheets of skin had peeled away from their tissues to hang down like rags on a scarecrow. They moved like a line of ants. All through the night, they went past our house, but this morning they had stopped. I found them lying on both sides of the road so thick that it was impossible to pass without stepping on them." I lay with my eyes shut while Dr. Tabuchi was talking, picturing in my mind the horror he was describing. I neither saw nor heard Mr. Katsutani when he came in. It was not until I heard someone sobbing that my attention was attracted, and I recognized my old friend. I had known Mr. Katsutani for many years and knew him to be an emotional person, but even so, to see him break down made tears come to my eyes. He had come all the way from Jigozen to look for me, and now that he had found me, emotion overcame him. He turned to Dr. Sasada and said brokenly, "Yesterday it was impossible to enter Hiroshima, else I would have come. Even today fires are still burning in some places. You should see how the city has changed. When I reached the Misasa Bridge this morning, everything before me was gone, even the castle. These buildings here are the only ones left anywhere around. The communications bureau seemed to loom right in front of me long before I got anywhere near here." Mr. Katsutani paused for a moment to catch his breath and went on. "I really walked along the railroad tracks to get here, but even they were littered with electric wires and broken railway cars, and the dead and wounded lay everywhere. When I reached the bridge, I saw a dreadful thing. It was unbelievable. There was a man, stone dead, sitting on his bicycle as it leaned against the bridge railing. It is hard to believe that such a thing could happen." He repeated himself 2 or 3 times as if to convince himself that what he said was true, and then continued, "It seems that most of the dead people were either on the bridge or beneath it. You could tell that many had gone down to the river to get a drink of water and had died where they lay. I saw a few live people still in the water, knocking against the dead as they floated down the river. There must have been hundreds and thousands who fled to the river to escape the fire and then drowned. The sight of the soldiers, though, was more dreadful than the dead people floating down the river. I came onto I don't know how many, burned from the hips up, and where the skin had peeled, their flesh was wet and mushy. They must have been wearing their military caps because the black hair on top of their heads was not burned. It made them look like they were wearing black lacquer bowls. And they had no faces. Their eyes, noses, and mouths had been burned away, and it looked like their ears had melted off. It was hard to tell front from back. One soldier, whose features had been destroyed and was left with his white teeth sticking out, asked me for some water, but I didn't have any. I clasped my hands and prayed for him. He didn't say anything more. His plea for water must have been his last words. The way they were burned, I wonder if they didn't have their coats off when the bomb exploded. It seemed to give Mr. Katsutani some relief to pour out his terrifying experiences on us, and there was no one who would have stopped him, so fascinating was his tale of horror. While he was talking, several people came in and stayed to listen. Somebody asked him what he was doing when the explosion occurred. "I had just finished breakfast," he replied, and was getting ready to light a cigarette when all of a sudden I saw a white flash. In a moment, there was a tremendous blast. Not stopping to think, I let out a yell and jumped into an air raid dugout. In a moment, there was such a blast as I have never heard before. It was terrific. I jumped out of the dugout and pushed my wife into it. Realizing something terrible must have happened in Hiroshima, I climbed up onto the roof of my storehouse to have a look. Mr. Katsutani became more intense and, gesticulating wildly, went on. Towards Hiroshima, I saw a big black cloud go billowing up, like a puffy summer cloud. Knowing for sure then that something terrible had happened in the city, I jumped down from my storehouse and ran as fast as I could to the military post at Hatsukaichi. I ran up to the officer in charge and told him what I had seen and begged him to send somebody to help in Hiroshima, but he didn't even take me seriously. He looked at me for a moment with a threatening expression, and then do you know what he said? He said, "There isn't much to worry about. 1 or 2 bombs won't hurt Hiroshima." There was no use talking to that fool. I was the ranking officer in the local branch of the Ex-Officers Association, but even I didn't know what to do because that day the villagers under my command had been sent off to Miyajima for labor service. I looked all around to find someone to help me make a rescue squad, but I couldn't find anybody. While I was still looking for help, wounded people began to stream into the village. I asked them what had happened, but all they could tell me was that Hiroshima had been destroyed and everybody was leaving the city. With that, I got on my bicycle and rode as fast as I could towards Itsukaichi. By the time I got there, the road was jammed with people, and so was every path and byway. Again, I tried to find out what had happened, but nobody could give me a clear answer. When I asked these people where they had come from, they would point towards Hiroshima and say, "This way." And when I asked where they were going, they would point toward Miyajima and say, "That way." Everybody said the same thing. I saw no badly wounded or burned people around Itsukaichi, but when I reached Kusatsu, nearly everybody was badly hurt. The nearer I got to Hiroshima, the more I saw until by the time I had reached Koi, they were all so badly injured. I could not bear to look into their faces. They smelled like burning hair. Mr. Katsutani paused for a moment to take a deep breath and then continued. The area around Koi Station was not burned, but the station and the houses nearby were badly damaged. Every square inch of the station platform was packed with wounded people. Some were standing, others lying down. They were all pleading for water. Now and then you could hear a child calling for its mother. It was a living hell, I tell you. It was a living hell. Today, it was the same way. Did Dr. Hanioka come to the hospital yesterday? I saw him cross the streetcar trestle at Koi and head in this direction, but I can't believe that he could have made his way through that fire. No, we haven't seen him, someone answered. Mr. Katsutani nodded reflectively and went on. I left Koi Station and went over to the Koi Primary School. By then, the school had been turned into an emergency hospital and was already crowded with desperately injured people. Even the playground was packed with the dead and dying. They looked like so many codfish spread out for drying. What a pitiful sight it was to see them lying there in the hot sun. Even I could tell they were all going to die. Towards evening, I was making my way back to the highway when I ran into my sister. My sister, whose home had been in Tokaichi, must surely have been killed. But here she was, alive. She was so happy, she couldn't utter a word. All she could do was cry. If ever anyone shed tears of joy, she did. Some kind people lent me a hand in making a stretcher and helped carry her back to my home in Jigozen near Miyajimaguchi. Even my little village, as far removed as it was from Hiroshima, had become a living hell. Every shrine, every temple was packed and jammed with wounded people. Mr. Katsutani had said all he had in him to say. He left our room, but instead of going home, he stayed to help with the wounded. The stories of Dr. Nishimura, Dr. Tabuchi, and Mr. Katsutani left no doubt in my mind about the destruction of Hiroshima. I had seen enough to know that the damage was heavy, but what they had told me was unbelievable. When I thought of the injured, lying in the sun begging for water, I felt as though I were committing a sin by being where I was. I no longer felt quite so sorry for those of our patients who were obliged to lie on the hard concrete floors in the toilets. My thoughts turned to myself. If only I hadn't been hurt, I mused, I could be doing something instead of lying here as a patient, requiring the attention of my comrades, wounded and helpless. What a plight, when all about me there is so much to do. Fortunately, my dismal thoughts were interrupted. Who should make an appearance but Dr. Hanaoka, our internist, whom Mr. Katsutani had just told us was last seen at Hatsukaichi. "Dr. Hachiya, you don't know how happy I am to see you," exclaimed Dr. Hanaoka. "After seeing what has happened to Hiroshima, it's a miracle anyone survived." "We have been worrying about you, Dr. Hanaoka," I replied, "because Mr. Katsutani told us only a few minutes ago that he saw you disappear in the direction of Hiroshima while he was at the koi station yesterday. Where have you been, and how did you get here?" "Now that I'm here, I wonder myself," said Dr. Hanaoka. "Let me tell you, if I can, what happened. Somebody told me that a special new bomb was dropped near the Gokoku shrine. If what I was told is true, then that bomb must have had terrific power, for from the Gokoku shrine clean out to the Red Cross Hospital, everything is completely destroyed. The Red Cross Hospital, though badly damaged, was spared, and beyond, going towards Ujina, the damage is slight. I stopped by the Red Cross Hospital on my way here. It is swamped with patients, and outside the dead and dying are lined up on either side of the street as far east as the Miyuki Bridge. Between the Red Cross Hospital and the center of the city, I saw nothing that wasn't burned to a crisp. Streetcars were standing at Kawayacho and Kamiyacho, and inside were dozens of bodies, blackened beyond recognition. I saw fire reservoirs filled to the brim with dead people who looked as though they had been boiled alive. In one reservoir, I saw a man, horribly burned, crouching beside another man who was dead. He was drinking blood-stained water out of the reservoir. Even if I had tried to stop him, it wouldn't have done any good. He was completely out of his heed. In one reservoir, there were so many dead people there wasn't enough room for them to fall over. They must have died sitting in the water. Even the swimming pool at the prefectural first middle school is filled with dead people. They must have suffocated while they sat in the water trying to escape the fire because they didn't appear to be burned. Dr. Hanaoka cleared his throat and after a moment continued, "Dr. Hachiya, that pool wasn't big enough to accommodate everybody who tried to get in it. You could tell that by looking around the sides. I don't know how many were caught by death with their heads hanging over the edge. In one pool, I saw some people who were still alive, sitting in the water with dead all around them. They were too weak to get out. People were trying to help them, but I am sure they must have died. I apologize for telling you these things, but they are true. I don't see how anyone got out alive." Dr. Hanaoka paused, and I could see he was anxious to get to work. With what there was to do, it would have been criminal to detain him. Gradually, what these visitors were telling me began to fit into a pattern. A few comments from this one, a few remarks from another, were beginning to give me a picture of what Hiroshima was like. Dr. Hanaoka had barely left when Dr. Akiyama, head of obstetrics and gynecology, came in. He was unhurt, but looked tired and worn. "Sit down and rest a few minutes," I said. "You must have been through a great deal. Where were you when the bombing occurred?" "I was just leaving my home when it went off," said Dr. Akiyama in a tremulous voice. A blinding flash, a tremendous explosion, and over I went on my back. And then a big black cloud, such as you see in the summer before a storm, began to rise above Hiroshima. "Yarareda!" I shouted. And that was it. What a hodgepodge was made of my house. The ceilings, the walls, the sliding doors, everything ruined beyond repair. Almost at once, injured people began to line up before my gate, and from then until a little while ago, I stayed and treated them. But my supplies are all gone, and there is nothing left to treat them with. 20 or 30 people are still lying in the house, and there is nobody to take care of them. There is nothing anybody can do unless I find some more supplies." Dr. Akiyama, ordinarily easygoing and happy, had the look of a man distraught. Dr. Koyama came in while Dr. Akiyama was talking, and so heard most of what he had been saying. "Knowing you, I can imagine what you have gone through," said Dr. Koyama. "I don't know," sighed Dr. Akiyama. "Today it's the same as it was yesterday. There is no end to that stream of miserable souls who stop at my house to ask for help. They are trying to reach Kabe, but they will never get there, and there is nothing I can do, nothing anybody can do." Since Dr. Akiyama's home was in Nagatsuka, I got a general idea of what that suburb was like. The problem there was the same as in the Koi area. I could picture in my mind the wounded people walking in silence, like lost spirits, and answering, when questioned, that they had come this way and were going that way. I could see them begging for water, hear their moaning, and see them dying. I might have been there myself, so vividly had my friends recounted to me what they had seen. It was reported that none of the patients had any appetite, and that one by one they were beginning to vomit and have diarrhea. Did the new weapon I had heard about throw off a poison gas, or perhaps some deadly germ? I asked Dr. Hanaoka to confirm if he could the report of vomiting and diarrhea, and to find out if any of the patients looked as if they might have an infectious disease. He inquired and brought word that there were many who not only had diarrhea but bloody stools, and that some had had as many as 40 to 50 stools during the previous night. This convinced me that we were dealing with bacillary dysentery and had no choice but to isolate those who were infected. Dr. Koyama, as deputy director, was given the responsibility of setting up an isolation ward. He chose a site on the grounds beyond the south side of the hospital, and with the help of some soldiers who happened along, he managed to construct what amounted to a crude outdoor pavilion. What we were trying to do probably was not worth much, but it helped our morale to think we were doing something. Dr. Katsube and his staff had an impossible task. There was scarcely a patient who was not in need of urgent surgical care. The doctors and nurses were all busy helping him. Even the clerical staff and janitors, and those among the patients who could so much as get about, were organized and instructed to help. If progress was made, it was hard to see. How Dr. Katsube did what he did was a miracle. The corridors were cleared enough to be passable, but in a little while they were as crowded as before. One difficulty was the influx of people looking for friends and relatives. Parents, half crazy with grief, searched for their children. Husbands looked for their wives and children for their parents. One poor woman, insane with anxiety, walked aimlessly here and there through the hospital calling her child's name. It was dreadfully upsetting to patients, but no one had the heart to stop her. Another woman stood at the entrance, shouting mournfully for someone she thought was inside. She, too, upset us. Not a few came in from the country to look for friends or relatives. They would wander among the patients and peer rudely into every face, until finally their behavior became so intolerable that we had to refuse them entrance to the hospital. A new noise reached us from outside. On inquiry, I was told that Dr. Koyama had procured a company of soldiers to clean out the fire-damaged communications bureau so that it could be put in use again as an annex to the hospital. The pharmacy came to life. Our meager supply of drugs was sorted and prepared for use under the watchful supervision of Dr. Hinoi and Mr. Mizoguchi. A little order was appearing. Something positive was being done. Perhaps in time we could get control of the situation. Mr. Serra, the business manager, reported. He told me that 16 patients had died during the night and that he had shrouded their bodies in white blankets and deposited them at the side entrance to the hospital. Can we spare those blankets at a time like this? I thought to myself. I was reluctant to object openly to what Mr. Serra had done because his action had been prompted by his sense of propriety and respect for the dead. When I discovered, however, that the army detail, dispatched to remove the dead, had thrown the bodies, blankets and all, onto the platform of a truck without any ceremony whatsoever, I seized on this indignity to suggest that our blankets be saved. The living needed the blankets more than the dead. Patients continued to come from all directions, and since we were not far removed from the center of the explosion, those who came were in a critical condition. Their behavior was remarkable. Even though the ones in the hospital fared little better than those on the outside, they were grateful for a pallet in the most crowded ward. It seemed to satisfy them if they could get so much as a glimpse of a white-robed doctor or nurse. A kind word was enough to set them crying. For the most trivial service, they would clasp their hands and pray for you. All were sufferers together and were confident that the doctors and nurses would do their best for them. Later, word came that this hospital was considered a good place to be in. The remark pleased us, but we were never able to feel that we had done as much as we should. Earlier in the day, Mr. Imachi and those who worked with him in the kitchen managed to prepare some rice gruel which they brought in by the bucketful and dished out with big wooden spoons. For me, this simple gruel made the one bright spot in the day. It was served again that afternoon, and the mouthful I had, and the grain of rice that remained on my tongue, made me feel that I was going to get well. But there were many who were too weak or too sick to eat. In time, the weakness of hunger added to their misery. Night approached, and still the only beds were straw mats laid over the concrete floor. Wounds were becoming more painful, and there were not enough drugs to make them easy. Fevers rose, and the patients became thirsty, but there was no one to bring cool water to quench the thirst. Dr. Harada, one of our pharmacists, was brought into the hospital severely burned, and right after him, old Mrs. Saeki's son in the same condition. Miss Hinata, one of our nurses, had to be confined because of a severe diarrhea that had begun earlier in the day. Since there was no one to nurse her, her mother, despite being seriously burned, was trying to do the job. Mr. Mizoguchi came in. Dr. Hachiya, I must tell you that Miss Hinata and her mother have become worse. It doesn't look like either of them will live through the night, and old Mrs. Saeki's son is losing consciousness. All day I had listened to visitors telling me about the destruction of Hiroshima and the scenes of horror they had witnessed. I had seen my friends wounded, their families separated, their homes destroyed. I was aware of the problems our staff had to face, and I knew how bravely they struggled against superhuman odds. I knew what the patients had to endure and the trust they put in the doctors and nurses, who, could they know the truth, were as helpless as themselves. By degrees, my capacity to comprehend the magnitude of their sorrow, to share with them the pain, frustration, and horror, became so dulled that I found myself accepting whatever was told me with equanimity and a detachment I would have never believed possible. In 2 days, I had become at home in this environment of chaos and despair. I felt lonely, but it was an animal loneliness. I became part of the darkness of the night. There were no radios, no electric lights, not even a candle. The only light that came to me was reflected in flickering shadows made by the burning city. The only sounds were the groans and sobs of the patients. Now and then, a patient in delirium would call for his mother, or the voice of one in pain would breathe out the word "Iraiyo." The pain is unbearable. I cannot endure it. What kind of a bomb was it that had destroyed Hiroshima? What had my visitors told me earlier? Whatever it was, it did not make sense. There could not have been more than a few planes. Even my memory would agree to that. Before the air raid alarm, there was the metallic sound of one plane and no more. Otherwise, why did the alarm stop? Why was there no further alarm during the 5 or 6 minutes before the explosion occurred? Reason as I would, I could not make the ends meet when I considered the destruction that followed. Perhaps it was a new weapon. More than one of my visitors spoke vaguely of a new bomb, a secret weapon, a special bomb, and someone even said that the bomb was suspended from 2 parachutes when it burst. Whatever it was beyond my comprehension. Damage of this order could have no explanation. All we had were stories no more substantial than the clouds from which we had reached to snatch them. One thing was certain. Hiroshima was destroyed, and with it, the army that had been quartered in Hiroshima. Gone were headquarters, gone the command post of the 2nd General Army and the military school for young people, the general headquarters for the Western Command, the corps of engineers, and the army hospital. Gone was the hope of Japan. The war was lost. No more help would come from the gods. American forces would soon be landing, and when they landed, there would be street fighting, and our hospital would become a place of attack and defense. Had I not heard earlier that soldiers were coming to set up headquarters in the Communications Bureau? Would we be turned out? Were there no answers? Dr. Sasada, Miss Kato, and my wife were asleep. That was good. But there was no sleep for me. I heard footsteps, and a man appeared at the door, outlined in the flickering darkness. His elbows were out and his hands down, like the burned people I had seen on my way to the hospital. As he came nearer, I could see his face, or what had been his face, because this face had been melted away by the fire. The man was blind and had lost his way. "You are in the wrong room!" I shouted, suddenly stricken with terror. The poor fellow turned and shuffled back into the night. I was ashamed for having behaved as I did, but I was frightened. Now, more awake than ever, every nerve taut, I could find no sleep. To the east, there was a perceptible lightening of the sky. My shouting must have wakened my wife because she got up and left the room, I suppose to find the toilet. Before long, she was back. "What is the matter, Yaiko-san?" I asked, sensing she was upset. "Oh, To-san, the hall was so full of patients that I could find nowhere to walk without disturbing someone," she answered, trying to suppress her agitation. "I had to excuse myself every step I took. Oh, it was terrible. Finally, I stepped on somebody's foot, and when I asked to be excused, there was no answer. I looked down, and do you know what I had done?" "What?" I asked. "I had stepped on a dead man's foot," she said, and with a shudder moved nearer. August 8th, 1945. The day began hot and clear. The sun was hardly up before my body was moist with oily sweat that dripped from my armpits and the inner sides of my thighs. Smoke no longer rose from the 2nd floor. Dr. Sasada's face was more swollen this morning than yesterday, and blood-stained pus oozed from his bandaged arms and hands. I felt a wave of pity when I thought how he had used those hands to help me 2 days ago. A noise outside the window caused me to recall a patient I neglected to mention yesterday. From time to time during the night, I had heard him walking about, and this morning he was walking again. You could hear him especially well when he stumbled into the fence or against the building. "Has he been fed?" I asked Miss Kato. "Don't worry, doctor," replied Miss Kato. "There are plenty of potato leaves in the garden, so I don't think he'll be hungry." The patient we were talking about was a horse who had been burned and blinded by the fire. Whoever saw him first did not have the heart to turn him away, so he was put in the garden under our window. This garden had been a tennis court, but some time ago I thought it could be better used as a garden, and I planted it in potatoes. My try at gardening caused no little amusement, and my potatoes came to be a joke. "Miss Kato," I asked, "don't you think we had better dig up the potatoes? They must be quite big by now." My companions laughed, and for a moment misery was forgotten. My left ankle began to hurt. Looking down, I discovered that it had become wet and sticky through the bandage. Miss Kato saw my concern and offered to change the dressing, and when she finished, the ankle felt better. While she was changing the dressing, though, I noticed a big blister on my left knee. This was a surprise because I could not recollect having received any burns. Later, I remembered the hot ember that struck my leg while I was lying in the garden behind the communications bureau. My appetite was better this morning, and I seemed to be stronger. Even my spirits were improved, and the dark thoughts that beset me during the night were less oppressive. Dr. Katsube came early. Instead of greeting him with a good morning, I asked him point blank when I could get up. He told me again that it would be at least a week before he could remove the stitches and that I was to say no more about getting up until then. "You are too impatient," he said. "You should be thankful that you are going to live." That I might die had never crossed my mind, but now that Dr. Katsube had spoken so bluntly, I realized that I must have been hurt worse than I thought. "Was I that bad off?" I asked, trying to appear nonchalant. "We were all worried about you," Dr. Katsube stated. "Perhaps you don't realize how much blood you lost. Why you remained comatose for the better part of the night. Your wife, Miss Kado, and Dr. Sasada, as well as Dr. Koyama and I, were, one or the other of us, at your side all night." "No wonder I remember so little of what happened that night," I replied, trying to pass off his comments lightly. "I should have been content to rest. Dr. Koyama was certainly doing a good job of running the hospital, and I was in touch with things. Not only did he keep me informed, but he referred matters to me for opinion where he might have acted without doing me that courtesy. A note, for example, came from Dr. Chodo, one of our dentists, which stated that he and his family were hiding in the hills behind Ushida. His family was unhurt, but he had been badly burned and asked if someone could bring him to the hospital. I sent for him, in spite of our critical shortage at the hospital. Another report informed us that the Welfare Department of the Communications Bureau had between 200 and 300 sleeping mats or tatami which could be procured for use in the hospital. Since these mats were roughly 3 by 6 feet in dimensions, the question arose, since we were so crowded, how we could get them under the patients. Mr. Sarah and I felt that, crowded or not, the sleeping mats must be used, even if it meant clearing all the corridors. A rumor that Mr. Yoshida, chief of the Communications Bureau, had been killed proved to be true. His charred body, identified by a belt buckle, was found near the hospital, and his remains were cremated in front of the Communications Bureau. In his death, we lost a kind and loyal friend. Another prominent person to be killed was Mayor Otsuka. I was startled to learn that I had been reported killed. The news was brought by 2 old friends, Mr. and Mrs. Nagao of Nishihara, who came looking for Yaeko-san and me this morning. We were happy to disprove the report of my death. During the day, an effort was made to sort and rearrange the patients according to the nature and severity of their injuries, and not a few dead were found among the living, though fewer than yesterday. It irritated me when I heard the report, for I felt that the dead should be moved with greater dispatch in order to make room for the living. This is another example of my changed outlook. People were dying so fast that I had begun to accept death as a matter of course and ceased to respect its awfulness. I considered a family lucky if it had not lost more than 2 of its members. How could I hold my head up among the citizens of Hiroshima with thoughts like that in my mind? Soldiers began to work again in the Communications Bureau. Dr. Koyama and I discussed the feasibility of getting them to help clear one of the floors for the patients quartered in the toilets and corridors. While we were talking, Dr. Hanoka informed us that bloody diarrhea was increasing and that some had had as many as 60 stools since daybreak. For the moment, a hospital annex in the Communications Bureau seemed less urgently needed than an enlarged isolation ward, so the soldiers were asked to help with the latter. The problem of how to reutilize the hospital came up for discussion because the fire-damaged second story had cooled down enough to be used. Before the fire, there had been 14 rooms above us, but since all the partitions were now destroyed, nothing remained but one single large room. The question as to who among the patients should be moved upstairs provoked lively debate, since it seemed at the time that the burned-out second floor was far less desirable than the first, despite the crowding. It was finally decided that we, as staff members, should be the first to go up and leave the more desirable ground floor for patients from the outside. I was moved first, and when my stretcher cleared the landing, my inquiring eyes fixed on the stark and twisted remains of 30-odd iron bed frames, under each of which lay a white ash residue of the straw mattresses that had once covered them. There was not a sound bed frame on the floor, but after the 2 days spent lying on the concrete floor, the very sight of these beds was magnificent. Yaiko-san and I found beds near each other that were not too badly bent. Our sleeping mats were placed over the frames, and without further ado, we were ready to resume life in our new quarters. Dr. Sasada, Miss Susukita, and Miss Omoto joined us, and one by one other members of the staff were brought up until the big room became alive with people. One might have complained about the soot and ashes or about the pipes and curtain rods that hung crazily from the ceiling, but patients never lived in a hospital ward so nearly free of bacteria as this one that was sterilized by fire. In all 4 walls were large casement windows, which afforded a commanding view in every direction. There were no shutters, no curtains, nor even glass to impose the least obstruction to air or light. Looking east, south, and west was an unobstructed view of Hiroshima, and in Hiroshima Bay we could see the island Ninoshima. Near the center of the city, some 1,500 meters distant, one could see the blackened ruins of the 2 largest buildings in Hiroshima, the Fukuya department store and the Chugoku press building. Hijiyama, the sacred and beautiful little mountain in the eastern sector of the city, looked almost close enough to touch. To our north, no buildings remained. For the first time, I could understand what my friends had meant when they said Hiroshima was destroyed. Nothing remained except a few buildings of reinforced concrete, 2 of which I have just mentioned. For acres and acres, the city was like a desert except for scattered piles of brick and roof tile. I had to revise my meaning of the word destruction, or choose some other word to describe what I saw. Devastation may be a better word, but really, I know of no word or words to describe the view from my twisted iron bed in the fire-gutted ward of the communications hospital. I could see the soldiers working on our isolation ward. One took the lead in a work song and the others answered in chorus, verse for verse. In no time, a 10-tsubo addition to the ward was completed. Behind this, they constructed an outdoor toilet with partitions of straw mats. From where I lay, the mats provided no concealment. A gentle breeze blew through the windows, bringing relief to our fevered bodies. Gone were the confusion and disorder we had known downstairs. The abundant light from wide-open windows and the distant vistas did something to our spirits. The very simplicity of our surroundings, contrasted with the chaos below, had a soothing effect. We thought we had left the better part of the hospital for the patients downstairs, but now that we had moved in, all agreed that ours were the better quarters. I resolved to have this room made available to the others as soon as possible. Towards evening, a light, southerly wind blowing across the city wafted to us an odor suggestive of burning sardines. I wondered what could cause such a smell until somebody, noticing it too, informed me that sanitation teams were cremating the remains of people who had been killed. Looking out, I could discern numerous fires scattered about the city. Previously, I had assumed the fires were caused by burning rubble. Towards Nijitsu was an especially large fire where the dead were being burned by hundreds. To suddenly realize that these fires were funeral pyres made me shudder, and I became a little nauseated. Concrete buildings near the center of the city, still afire on the inside, made eerie silhouettes against the night sky. These glowing ruins and the blazing funeral pyres set me to wondering if Pompeii had not looked like this during its last days. But I think there were not so many dead in Pompeii as there were in Hiroshima. For nearly 3 days the hospital staff had been laboring with scarcely a break, so tonight, in order to give them a little respite, a space was cleared in our upstairs ward and alternate shifts were ordered to rest. Dr. Koyama stopped to talk a few minutes before lying down and told me some of the things that had happened during the day. In the morning, a group of soldiers had come to the entrance, demanding bandages for the 2nd General Army, and despite the staff's assertion that our materials were low, made away with nearly all we had. These men behaved more like brigands than soldiers. Moreover, what they did was contrary to what we had been told to expect, because the army had repeatedly promised to supply us with emergency goods in case of attack. These soldiers could not have come from the army that had been stationed in Hiroshima. There were not enough soldiers left in that group to help with the wounded soldiers brought to the hospital. The army was unable to provide for the wounded family of the local commandant, whom we had made room for in one of the toilets. When the commandant's adjutant found them, he could find no better place to take them and was grateful when we managed to squeeze them into the janitor's office. The soldiers who got our supplies must have come from somewhere else. We had further cause to worry. Dr. Koyama told me that soldiers from somewhere had been around all day cleaning out the communications bureau, and that rumors were current that an army headquarters was to be set up to direct a defense of Hiroshima in case of invasion. We both agreed that if an army should move in, our hospital would become a target for more bombing, and next time we would all be killed. After Dr. Koyama left, I continued to think along these lines, became upset, and could not sleep. I could hear every little sigh during the night, every plea for water, every groan. One of the dysentery patients who had been transferred to the isolation ward went to the back of the bureau to get a drink of water. I heard a rude man scold him and tell him to go away, lest he pass his dysentery onto him. One voice called repeatedly for water, and as the night wore on, the voice became weaker. I asked a nurse who the patient was, and she told me that he was a young officer who appeared to be from a decent family because every time she gave him a drink of water, he thanked her politely. Mention of the young officer called to mind a visit Yaeko-san and I had had on the 2nd of August. A cousin, Captain Urabe, and his wife spent the day with us. Captain Urabe had been recruited as an army doctor shortly after he graduated from medical school, and when I saw him, he had been eating army food for 6 or 7 years in northern and central China. To me, he appeared well-disciplined and courageous. I was pessimistic about the outcome of the war and told him so. I confided that I thought we were going to lose because everything was becoming scarce and the soldiers were no longer disciplined. I said that I was afraid Hiroshima was going to be bombed and that if it were, the anti-aircraft guns would be useless. Our defenses had been prepared for incendiary bombing, and I considered it nonsensical to think the enemy would use incendiary bombs on a city with as many rivers and vacant lots as there were in Hiroshima. To this my cousin listened calmly, and then replied, "Nissan, don't you worry for a minute. The Chief of Staff has said that no matter how much the nation criticizes the army will reply with victory." As I lay there in the dark, I mumbled to myself, "Reply with victory." Where was my cousin now? If I could find him, he might be able to get us the medical supplies we needed. Captain Urabe must be busy, otherwise he would have come to see me before now.